All right. Love seeing everyone popping in from all over. This is exciting. Well, thank y'all for being here today. If you have not joined us before, my name is Lacey Hensley. I'm the director of the Institute for Coordinated Community Response. We are a program of the Conference on Crimes Against Women. And Jen, do you mind going to the next slide there?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. So ICCR is a TA project for rural communities, and we're funded through OVW. So we have that great little disclaimer there that says that they may not agree with all of the findings and conclusions, recommendations expressed in the publications and programs. So yeah, well, today we have the great pleasure of being with some friends of ours. This is Jennifer Landhuis, who's the director of Spark, and joining her is Sergeant Denise Jones from the Clark County, Ohio Sheriff's Office. They both are longtime friends of ICCR and the conference, and super excited to have you. So I am going to hang tight. I'm going to go off camera, but I will help in monitoring the chat and Q&A if y'all need that. And we'll see you at the end. Thanks.
Thanks, Lacey. Hi, everyone. As Lacey said, my name is Jennifer Landhuis. I'm the director of SPARK, which is the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. We are also funded by the Office on Violence Against Women. So our disclaimer is at the bottom of the slide. And I have with me one of our law enforcement consultants, who's also a great friend of mine. So Denise, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Sergeant Denise Jones. Again, like Lacey said, I work in Springfield, Ohio for the Clark County Sheriff's Office. I'm also a consultant for Spark and a couple of other different entities and trained nationally on this topic and other gender-based violence topics.
Well, we appreciate you all being with us this afternoon. If you're not familiar, January is Stalking Awareness Month, so appropriate that we get to spend some time with you today. One of the things that we just want to point out as we go through today is we've got some objectives that we want to hopefully cover in the 90 minutes that we have together, but depending on how much time we have for questions, et cetera, sometimes we don't get through everything that we wanted to. Happy to make the PowerPoint available to Lacey so that she can share it with all of you. But this particular project is a project that we received from OVW to focus on the investigation and prosecution of online crimes. So specifically cyber stalking, doxing, intimate image distribution. So what we wanted to try to do today is kind of do an overview of some of the tech facilitated behaviors that we see in these particular cases, give you an idea of some of the things that we're seeing offenders use, but really try to focus on how are we using the tools that we all have in our toolbox to be able to hold the offenders accountable in these cases and enhance victim safety, which we all know is a real important cornerstone of these particular cases. If you've ever seen Spark do a presentation before, you've heard us talk about the SLI framework. SLI stands for surveillance, life invasion, interference, usually through some kind of sabotage or attack, and intimidation. And those particular behaviors are really the kind of cornerstone of stalking cases. What we see oftentimes happen in stalking cases is that people are very much focused on the surveillance piece of things, where somebody's watching, waiting, et cetera. And we don't necessarily think about all the different behaviors that happen in these particular cases and how offenders might be using technology to invade the life of a victim or to intimidate them. And so we wanted to give you some of the examples of some of the things that we see playing out in these particular cases. So for things like life invasion, where we have offenders who might hack into victims' accounts, they might pretend to be the victim because they want to bring that evidence to court, or they want to come in and make a report to Sergeant Jones and say, see, this other person's actually harassing me. Or they might be trying to interfere with a victim's life, so ruining their reputation, posting intimate images, et cetera. And what we really want you to be thinking about is just all the different ways that technology is invading this particular individual's life, how a victim's impacted by those technologies, and how we can try to gather some of that particular evidence. What I hear a lot, and I know Denise will absolutely interject if she wants to, in these particular cases from law enforcement and those who are involved in gathering some of the evidence, is that when it turns to the tech cases, then people have a tendency to get overwhelmed. And we forget some of the basic principles that, sometimes we can have victims testify about the things that they see, or sometimes, bringing in screenshots, et cetera. There might be some simple solutions to gathering some of this particular evidence. And when it's not simple, there are some great resources out there that can help. So build our toolbox as investigators and as prosecutors. Go ahead, Denise. I can tell you want to say something.
Yeah,
See the
a
thought
lot.
bubble.
I know, right? A lot of times we don't see just a singular style of stalking, right? A lot of times, most of these things are very interchangeable. You'll have a lot of these things going on. Different things are happening at different times. A lot of times we look at to see how tech savvy that offender is. And then how tech savvy that victim may be. But it's really ensuring that when you start working with these folks, you're asking them, I guess, essentially what their lifestyle, what they have access to or have had access to, and what they're comfortable with. Because if it's somebody that I know Jen talks a lot about Apple AirTags. We don't in our area see a lot of Apple AirTags, but we will see other things like apps are being used. But we always typically, I would say 90% of the time, see that traditional stalking in there as well, right? It's just using those other pieces to help facilitate that stalking. Or when it transitions to I've blocked in some areas, I'm gonna use something else. So again, it's not usually something singular. It's usually a lot of these things combined in one particular case, and some of these things can be heavy lifts.
Absolutely. I think the other thing that we want to be thinking about in these particular cases is there's a different approach when it comes to really enhancing safety for victims. There's some things that those of you who are advocating for victims, regardless of whether your title is an advocate, most of us are advocating for our victims, but there's some things that we can do to kind of like target harden a victim. And there's some things where we need to pull in our law enforcement partners. And so we were really trying to kind of break up these things to figure out like what interventions can we do as folks who are advocating for victims, and what things do we really need to try to pull law enforcement in for. So as you look at this particular slide and the slide that we're going to share next, one of the things that we want to be thinking about is if we have an offender who perhaps owns a device or owns some kind of an account, the Gmail account, et cetera, they've shared a device. So if it's an intimate partner case, or they bought a device for the survivor or the children that they have in common, or they're guessing things like passwords and logins, there are some things that we can do to try to target harden a victim. So it might be things like changing accounts and passwords. It might be, getting a different account, or not logging into their Gmail account anymore and getting a new Gmail account. But then there's things that we're going to have to pull in Denise and others on the law enforcement side when it becomes criminal. So if we have somebody who's doxing somebody else, they're threatening blackmail, et cetera, those particular things oftentimes require law enforcement to either be able to charge something or at least have a conversation with the offender about those particular things. And I see you, another thought bubble.
Yeah,
I
right.
feel like I can read your mind,
It's
which
like
is
you know me,
scary.
right? So as she splits this up, right, it says advocacy at the top and law enforcement at the bottom. I know there are some advocates on here, and for the law enforcement folks, understand like typically advocates are seeing these folks before we do, right? 6 to 12 months before they're self-identifying, they're being stalked. Typically, when they first come in to meet with me, or they'll call in on 911 or non-emergency number, right? Something's not right. They feel as though something's going on. Both of these blocks are important to me as a law enforcement officer, right? And our advocates are doing a lot of that groundwork before they get to us. But I need to know those things too. So if your advocate's working with law enforcement, or your advocate's hoping to work with law enforcement, these are not just singular things that are broken up between the two groups, right? These are things that we use together to really understand the full picture of what's going on here. Because I need to know as a law enforcement officer what they have access to, have they owned that device, and a lot of other things, right? So these things go hand in hand. And for the law enforcement officers understand, like, it is so hard for you to do this job without advocates. Like, advocates are, man, they've been doing this stuff before we started doing this stuff. They're far better at managing these particular folks. And I always like when Jennifer talks about what it looks like to safety plan with someone, right? Because I tactically safety plan, y'all safety plan for all the other things that I just don't account for. But these two things are needed on for me as a law enforcement officer. So I see their split there, but keep in mind the law enforcement officers and the advocates, right? I need to know all of that to have context as to what I'm looking for and what interventions I need to put in play or preservation requests or whatever that may look like as quickly as I possibly can because some of this information disappears before I can get it.
And one of the things that Denise and I talk about when we do this presentation is we know that for some individuals, it's not safe for them to come to talk to law enforcement. They don't want to have an interaction with law enforcement. So throughout the presentation, we're trying to give you some tips and tools that you can use regardless if somebody chooses to go in and make a report to law enforcement, right? There may be some things that victims can work with survivors on being able to be able to enhance their safety. And I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind is these are old techniques with new methods, right? Stalking's been around back in the day. Some of us are old enough to remember when stalkers had to get up off the couch to go stalk somebody. Don't roll your eyes at me, Denise. We're about the same age. But seeing now in a lot of our cases where the technology is more and more pervasive, but just keeping in mind that it's some of those same old power and control tactics that we see, it's just a new method of that. And so what we want to be thinking about is a lot of times we have stalkers who might use some simple technologies that are easily available, find my iPhone, that type of thing to be able to keep track of somebody. But sometimes it's a little bit more complex than that. So I think as we have seen that technology grow and as we have seen the ability to do things like ask ChatGPT, how do I stalk my girlfriend? Or how do I install some kind of stalkerware, et cetera, it's actually made things even easier. You know, it used to be when we did tech facilitated stalking cases, our stalking training, we would say, oh, usually it's pretty simple methods, but we've seen the methods become more and more complex as the technologies have gone out there. But don't forget about the simple methods as well.
Yeah, and to kind of piggyback on that, Jen, I was at the Conference on Crimes Against Women last year, and if you haven't attended, please, great conference, right, to put a plug in for that. But search.org, and I know we talk about resources a little bit later, but one of the things that they talked about is how AI is being used to stalk and how you can essentially ask Chat GPT to call a number. With the frequency, leave voice messages, send text messages, and that stuff's going to be really hard for us as law enforcement officers to find, to get any kind of service on, and to get any kind of evidentiary value. Also, keep in mind if that person's being stalked, bringing them to your PD is not always the safest thing, right? Keep in mind that if they are or had been sharing location, that offender may see where that person's at. So just keep the presence of mind that maybe coming to your PD isn't the safest place for that victim either.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Denise. We see so often well-meaning individuals who are like, oh, you know, if you think there's a tracker on your car, if you think that person's monitoring you, go ahead and go down to the police department and make a report. Well, now we've just tipped off the offender that that person is cooperating with and participating with law enforcement. So just some things to be thinking about. Anything you want to highlight on this particular slide, Denise, that stands out to you as far as investigations go, or something that we can kind of just...
Yeah, so for sure. I have the luxury, obviously, of reading all the reports that come into our agency. So it sometimes is a little bit easier for me to ascertain if there are multiple events affecting the same individual or have the same two or three individuals surrounding them, right? But it's really when you look at strategies for investigation, it's identifying that stalking as soon as you possibly can. Because Jen has talked about tech facilitated, a lot of this stuff can disappear fairly quickly, and it behooves us to ask good questions. So if you're getting first line officers out there, you know, really putting some tools in their toolbox to help identify these things as quickly as we possibly can, even outside of just intimate partner stuff, right? Because as Jen, I'm sure will tell you, or if it's in here, right, that's not the prevalent stalking. It is a good token of it, right? But understanding how we need to connect non-intimate partner stalking cases together too. And I think that's sometimes where we struggle the most because there is no intimate relationship here and that victim's not self-identifying and we're not really putting all of these things together, especially if they're not happening for the same agency. So it's putting some tools in the toolbox to help identify that and asking good questions. And I always like to present options to the victim, right? Because Jen's already said it, and I'm sure we'll say it again today. It's not always safe for folks to report, and it's not always safe for folks to go through the criminal justice system if they in fact have access to the criminal justice system. And getting that protection order doesn't always make them safer. And it does say on here to involve advocates as early as possible. I cannot stress that enough, right? Because these advocates are the ones that are doing that work for us. I have a good working relationship with our advocates here. They'll prep them before they ever get in here, right? So I'm not asking them the same stuff over and over and over again. But it's really making sure that you're, if possible, identify what's going on with that victim, what you need as quickly as possible, and then getting that advocate in to support them, and then giving them options, right? Again, because it's not always the best course of action to drop a protection order and start going through the criminal justice system because that can escalate that offender.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that you and I have a lot of conversations about too, Denise, is because we're really fun. We talk stalking both at work and not at work.
Right.
But when we think
Good
about
job.
electronic evidence, really trying to make sure that we're staying offender focused, right? So focus on the things that we need to be able to hold that offender accountable. Anything that stands out to you from this particular slide that you want to reiterate to folks?
Again, I always like to do a good thorough. So even if that person interacts with a first line officer before they talk to me, I like to get them in to talk to me and do a good history so I can ascertain if it was former intimate partner, current intimate partner, or a non-intimate partner, what that looks like, identifying those power differences between that offender and victim, because I've had these cases that will go on for 2+ years, right? And to watch that victim have to constantly be hyper vigilant. And then sometimes my offenders will call in and say that they're being stalked. So I love to get offenders in and try to interview them, and say, hey, like you told me you were being stalked, let's talk about it, and then get them on the record, locking them into a statement, and or having them at the end of the conversation say, well, no, I'm not really stalked, I'm not really being stalked, and I can totally see how my victim feels as though she's being stalked, and then explaining that counterintuitive behavior. Protection orders are only as strong as we allow them to be, right? And so I try to always stress like, hey, you've done the part of getting the protection order. We've made it that far. Like we have to let that protection order work for us, right? And then it goes back to asking, or giving options and choices. Do you want me to contact the offender? And that says something to me as a law enforcement officer, right? If the victim is okay with early onset, me contacting the offender and saying, hey, you're on notice. I understand what you're doing, and they'll deny it. I'm fine with that. You're on notice. If your conduct continues, I'm going to start charging you. And then more often than not, what I see is they continue. And that says something to me as a law enforcement officer, right? That means that person's committed. And it may not be like, I'm gonna start throwing charges and they're gonna stop. But I do like to look at all these power differences between the folks, and I do like to rebuke that offender's claims, because again, offenders are gonna tell me that I'm wrong, they're being stalked, this is not true, that person's crazy, they're just a jealous ex, A, B, and C, and really locking them in and then start focusing on them. They don't like it. So it helps my victims get a little bit of breathing room sometimes as well.
Denise, I'm looking at some of the questions and answers that are coming in on that chat, and folks are already asking. Someone was asking, when you gave that example of chat GPT calls, they're asking what comes out in the phone logs.
So it will come from a random number that the computer sets up. So that's totally being run by the computer program. It's not being run by a telephone. And so when I took the class with search.org, they essentially said that the offender had put it on a 15-minute time lapse. So every 15 minutes, it would call that victim, from a random number that the computer assigned.
Yeah. The other thing that we want to be thinking about when we're trying to delve into like what kind of technology might be in use, what do we need a safety plan around? One of the questions that we really focus on is like who owns the tech or who set up the tech. So does the survivor have their phone? The relationship ended, whatever. Did that individual, if it was an intimate partner case, are they the person who actually set up the technology? Like, do they have access? Would they know the passwords, et cetera? One of the things that, Denise and I jokingly have fights about, she already mentioned earlier, was the air tags. And she was like, we just don't see those cases. The cases that we see, oftentimes that are involving air tags, the offenders set up the technology and they've gone in and turned off the victim's Bluetooth. or they associated an AirTag with their account. And if the victim is on that account, looks like an owner of the account, then they wouldn't get any type of notification that their own AirTag is following them. So those questions about like ownership, et cetera, are really important. Also asking if you're working with individuals who've left a relationship, what kind of technology they may have left behind. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we talk about mapping out some of the devices. But also trying to see, if they were in an intimate partner relationship, did the offender want to have access to emails? Was Gmail pulled up on a common computer? What exactly does the offender know? I mean, we get a lot of questions and calls from folks, responders, advocates, otherwise, who will call Spark and be like, so this is a situation that I've got going on. This is what I think might be happening. What kind of technology do you think the offender might be using? And so sometimes it's as simple as, a lot of people will call and say, well, I think somebody hacked into their account. Most of us have this tendency to use the same username and password. So is it really hacking into the account, or is it I knew what password you were likely to use, or I had access to that account prior to the relationship? We're talking last week when Denise and I were doing a training in person about how we see things like DoorDash being used. Somebody forgets to log out of their common DoorDash account. Somebody else has the DoorDash. They send new DoorDash to their new address, new workplace, et cetera, and suddenly the offender has access to that. So thinking about things like that as far as location, did they have kids in common, that type of a thing, to really kind of get a good sense of what the offender might have access to. One of the things that continues to surprise me, and I swear it's just because if you Google, how do I hide my phone number? One of the things that still comes up is to tell people to dial *67. Now, we were dialing *67 back when we had landlines. And if you're under 30, just Google what a landline is, because you have no idea what we're talking about right now. But when we had landlines, we used to dial *67 all the time to hide what was going to show up on somebody's caller ID. And we still see offenders who will dial *67. And so keeping in mind that there are some tools that you can use if you have an offender who's doing something like calling *67. So if you dial *67, just shows up as an identified caller on the victim's caller ID. But there are actually apps that can unblock the block. So one of the apps that is out there that could be utilized in cases like this is something called Trap Call. We actually have a commercial from Trap Call they'll tell you exactly what they can do to help in these particular cases.
Here's how to unmask calls with Trap Call. When you receive calls from no caller ID, unknown, or restricted numbers, simply decline the call. On an iPhone, you do this by pressing your power button twice. On Android, you usually do this by swiping to decline. Trap Call then works its patented magic. Moments later, presto, your phone will ring with the unmasked caller ID. It's that easy. Decline the call and Trap Call tells you who's really calling.
So we've had instances where victims are continuing to get those unidentified calls come in. And so they will do something like install Trap Call, or they'll use some other product to be able to unblock the block. With things like Trap Call, if you put it on a victim's cell phone and they sign up for the service, it actually gives them access to a portal that will show who called, what the real number is. It will record every call. There is a button that you can toggle on if you live in a two-party state, that will send a warning that the call is about to be recorded. But otherwise, it just automatically records a phone call. And then victims can access that portal, and then they can download those calls, et cetera, and choose to send them to the investigator, to the prosecutor, somebody like that. So those things are options for folks if stuff like this is happening. Now, Trap Call only works if you have an offender who's dialing *67. It doesn't work if you have an offender who's, bought a boost phone at Walmart, or if they've just simply turned it off on their iPhone. But it's one of the simple tools that can be out there. It, of course, costs money, but it's never been my experience that people usually have to enroll in the service for longer than a month before they have ample evidence to be able to use in their case. So just something that we want to offer up as an option for folks. We still see Trap Call being used by survivors to gather some of that evidence and to be able to give that evidence to law enforcement or to prosecutors in their case. So wanted to offer that up to folks. Do you want to talk about text now, Denise?
Yeah, so we do get a lot of text now apps or app-based phone calls and text. These are some things that you can use. If you're not using search.org, it is free. Free carrier lookup will let you know what service the person has. We will still we will still be able to move forward even if that victim doesn't recognize that number, right? So a lot of times what we hear is I started getting private calls, or I started getting a bunch of phone calls and text messages from number I don't recognize. And we'll talk about it throughout the day, right? It's the context of the message. I always love it when deputies will say, well, I mean, she didn't recognize the number. But in the text message, it will say, like, I love you. I can't believe you took our baby daughter away. And I will simply ask, do you share a child in common with anybody else? No, I only have, okay. Like, there's no one else texting about why are you taking my baby daughter away, right? The private calls, right? I will always ask, like, what's the frequency that you got private calls prior to any of this happening, right? In and of itself, it may not be by itself enough, right? But if I'm putting everything together, I do like to, if there's any prosecutors on here, I apologize ahead of time, right? I do like to push the limits of what my prosecutor wants to take, right? Because I want to push things forward. I want to get accountability for offenders and give some kind of peace of mind for my victims. So I will try to push it forward, and it's about me as the law enforcement officer getting good context and getting asking good questions and getting good information, right? Because if this person has never ever received a private call, and now all of a sudden from 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. we're getting 75 private calls, like let's put two and two together here, right? And I anytime I want them to collect anything for me, right? So if I'm asking for screenshots, we go in and talk about how to screen record. We go in and talk about how to take screenshots. We take for granted, if you are even just remotely tech savvy, that everybody knows that you need to pull the screen over to see the time, right? Or to start the screenshots at the date or the day or whatever. If that's not the case all the time, I have to explain it. And I always start out by saying, hey, like, I'm not trying to talk about your experience with, but if you start to take screenshots, can you please start from here? Can you slide the screen over so I can see the timestamps on the side? If you start screen record, that's what this looks like. So anytime you're asking them or expecting them to collect evidence, you have to show them how, because you're going to get stuff back and you're going to look at it like, well, I can't do anything with this, and it may potentially be gone.
We've also seen that strategy of screen record can be effective in court, if
Mhm.
especially like in a protection order hearing or something like that, where the judge might not take the time to read the 37 printed
Yes.
pages of screenshots, but the 5 seconds of the screen record of showing how many
Oh,
times they're scrolling through those text messages can be really powerful. So that screen
yeah.
record is an option, and every phone has the option to screen record. Can be really great method. I get the pleasure of training lots of judges across the country, and they're always somehow amazed, more so by screen records than they are by screenshots. So definitely an option. Somebody said, do you know of an app that will sort text messages and show the dates and content? So there's some apps that you can put text messages into like PDF documents,
Yes.
but apps that actually will go through the text messages and sort date and contact, I don't know anything off the top of my head, but I will do some querying with some of our experts across the country as well, and I will let you know. So if you want to send me an email, you'll get our contact information at the end. If you want to remind me of that question, I will query a couple of other folks just to make sure. I don't know any of off the top of my head. But if anybody else does on the call, definitely put it in the chat.
Yeah. And the other thing about the significance of the screenshots or the screen recording, go to your prosecutor and ask, what would the judge prefer? That way, and you're not asking for screenshots when it's going to be more beneficial to have a screen recording.
Yeah. The other thing that we want to be thinking about when it comes to phone security is we see well-meaning individuals who are working with victims of stalking in their safety planning efforts. Sometimes jump to some conclusions or recommend some things that we need to kind of really think carefully about. Number one, anytime it involves technology, whether it's constant phone calls or text messages, or it's DMs on Instagram, people's kind of gut reaction is to say to a survivor, well, just get off Instagram or just change your phone number. So that if I was being stalked by Denise and she's calling me and she gets the, I'm sorry, this number is disconnected, then as a stalker, we're not going to make any more contact. Like some of the things that we need to be thinking about is when we have survivors who are unplugging from the technology, if they get off Instagram, if they change their phone number, sometimes what that does is actually escalate the stalker's behavior. Because now if I can't get a hold of Denise because she's not answering her phone or she got off Instagram, then I just show up in person. And so we've actually escalated the behavior from technology to in-person contact. And from a threat management standpoint, that's the last thing we want to do. The other thing that we see happen is a lot of times people will say, well, just get a new device. So get a new phone. And so they get a new phone and then they get onto their Google account or they get onto their Apple account and they reinstall all the apps and they use those same apps with the same logins and passwords. And essentially the stalking just chases them across the device. So when we look at phone security, the thing that we have to be thinking about is it the device that's compromised or is it an account that's compromised? So if it's a device that's compromised, then yeah, we might need to either think about factory resetting the device or getting a new device. But if it's the account that's compromised, perhaps we just need to get a new account and not a new phone. And so what I see are well-meaning individuals who are like, oh, you should go down and get a new cell phone plan, or you should get a new cell phone. And somebody ends up paying a lot of money to only have their phone compromised again because they put those same accounts back on the phone. So keeping in mind that if you have an offender and a victim who share a phone plan, again, those of us that are a little bit longer in our experience with doing this work, people still have a tendency to think, oh, if we look at phone plans, we might be able to see what was shared in this content of the text messages. You can see that a text message was sent, but not the content of the text messages, which could still be important if you have an offender who's monitoring, who somebody is texting. But the thing that some people aren't aware of is there's actually something called the Safe Connections Act. So if you have somebody who needs to get out of a cell phone plan, and because they shared it with the offender, because the offender pays for it, whatever, I have a lot of people say, well, they had to end up paying $1,200 to get a new cell phone plan. There's actually something called the Safe Connections Act, which says that a victim can leave a phone plan without any extra charges if they have some kind of written documentation from either a police officer, from an advocate, etc. Now, don't go down to your local Verizon store and talk to 19-year-old Preston who still lives in his mom's basement and works at the local Verizon store, because he's going to have no idea what the Safe Connections Act is. Okay? You're going to have to actually make contact with somebody at corporate, figure out what that looks like, etc., or ask to speak to somebody who might have a little bit more knowledge or understanding within that office. But we provided the information for you in this PowerPoint. What I would encourage you to do is just look it up for that particular provider. So if it's Verizon, what do they need to be able to get this survivor out of their phone plan? So please don't have survivors spend a ton of money trying to get out of that, so that we don't end up with survivors spending extra dollars when they could have used the Safe Connections Act. I'm looking in at some of the questions in the chat too, as we...
Yeah. And so the other thing is, I would also look at your protection orders to see if that's something that the protection order will grant as well. Like in our protection orders, it does say in there to sever the cell phone plan, so they can take that order with them to their carrier, and that will allow them to sever that plan as well.
Yeah. And somebody was interjecting in there, when it comes to the content of the text messages, that might be able to be figured out if you're doing like what people call a cell phone forensic exam or a phone dump. That's typically done by law enforcement. Like the everyday person can't do that. So if you have access to that, yes, you might be able to get the contents of the text message that way. But the contents of the text message simply by looking at somebody's phone records or phone plans, not going to happen. Yeah. So thanks for clarifying that, Denise and others in the chat. Let's see. Somebody said They've used iMazing to back up their mobile phone in the past, and text messages were displayed that way. Yep. So depending on how the phone's backed up. Somebody asked for, is safe connections only for domestic violence or other interpersonal violence? So we've seen it used for stalking and sexual assault cases as well. So definitely worth a shot. Again, I would definitely go to the corporate site and look up the Safe Connections Act and what might be needed. If you have a particular provider or somebody that you're working with and you need some help from us, you can always reach out to us for technical assistance, and we can try to see what we can do or help gather that if we need somebody who's in that type of situation. So great question, Megan. So in addition to the Safe Connections Act, we also want to be thinking about what kind of account issues might we have when we're trying to secure a phone. So is it a login issue, meaning, once we log out, is it two-factor setup if we log back in? And what are we sharing as far as locations go? And what apps are on the device that are shared or use some kind of unsecure login? So some of you have mentioned, you've seen Cash App used, you've seen Uber used, you've seen Venmo used, all those different things and ways of communicating. People have a tendency to think of, the big social media things owned by Meta, et cetera, as the way to contact somebody, but stalkers are becoming a lot more inventive with how they're contacting victims. And so being able to work with victims about the ways that the offender might contact them and the documentation that they might want to keep if they do get a request on Venmo, or if somebody's trying to send them money on Venmo. And to Denise's point, I think sometimes people don't necessarily think it's counterintuitive. Well, so the offender sent you $10 on Venmo, like, shouldn't you be happy that they sent you $10? So being able to have that conversation and asking those really great questions about, like, hey, what did that mean to you? Have they sent you money before? Why are they trying to send you money now? Is this their only way of contacting you? And so they resorted to Venmo, that type of a thing.
Yeah, and when you look at offenders, and it's tradition across the board, traditionally, not just with these particular crimes, right? If there is anything that can be exploited, an offender will learn how to exploit it before we learn how to counteract with that, right? Or how to get evidence from that. So offenders will literally use anything they possibly can that they can exploit for any crime, but specifically for these particular crimes. So if there is anything that that victim knows that offender has access to, they will find a way, most often not, to exploit it. Yes, and I've worked a case as well where they kept sending one penny. Yes, and because they get blocked everywhere else, and it's the only thing, because who wants to block people or thinks about blocking people on their Cash App? Yeah, 100%. Again, they'll use anything they can to exploit and try to contact that victim.
One of the things that we've also seen as a good safety strategy is if we have a survivor who's coming in to try to figure out, like, who has access to, say, for instance, their Apple account or to their Google account. I remember one incident, I actually got called by somebody who was a security officer at the hospital, offering security for not only people going in and out, but for their employees as well. And they had a nurse who was being stalked, had left their intimate partner, but somehow thought the intimate partner was still accessing some of their emails, et cetera. And so one of the things that they did was actually go into her Apple account. When they pulled up her Apple account, like you would see on the screen right here, they saw that one of the phones that was logging in was a newer iPhone. The victim didn't have a newer iPhone. She had, like, at the time, like an iPhone 6 or something like that. And what was logging in was like the 13 Pro or something like that. So once they were able to actually click on the 13 Pro, it gave them the model number and the serial number of the phone that was accessing that account. And it was the offender's. So they figured out that that was the way that the offender was gathering some of that information. So what he was actually doing is she was changing her schedule of when she was working and stuff like that on her phone. And he was gathering some of the information by accessing some of her Apple account information. So keeping in mind that there may be some ways that you can gather information off of the victim's phone to see who's logged in or log people out of those particular devices. Anything else that you want to add to this, Denise? Oh,
yeah, and it's not just about the devices, right? So, like, it's going in and just sitting down with that victim and going through different apps and different banking apps and different computers to see who social media websites and apps, who still has access to that, right? Jen talked about it earlier in the session, leaving old devices behind. You would be shocked and amazed on how easy it is to get access to something just by merely leaving a device that we just never thought about. I mean, I throw my old iPhones in a drawer most often than not, and it's like, I don't know that that's still there, right? And if it's a former or current intimate partner, they're going to know what the access code is, right?
Yeah.
They're probably going to have had access to that device. But it's looking at the apps, looking at the banking stuff. Even we've had people use utilities, right? Logging into other folks' utilities to see where the bill's going. So just making sure that you're sitting down with that victim and talking about all the things that someone could potentially have access to, and logging stuff out. And also thinking about what open source stuff is available. So like here, you can look up someone's address by their voter registry online, and that's open source information. So when you're changing addresses, I know there's a program, I think it's called Safe at Home, that gives a PO box. So just understanding, getting with advocates if you don't know what's available in your area, just knowing what they're putting out there that's open sourced by the offender. It's the same stuff I use as a law enforcement officer to track somebody down, right? And just making sure that they're kind of keeping some of that stuff secure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Those advocacy confidentiality programs
Yes.
that are safe at home. The other thing that we want to just remind folks is when we're setting up, especially new accounts with victims, one of the things that we will talk about is not using or not answering the security questions truthfully. Because if the offender has access to that information or has been stalking them, they know their mother's name, maiden name, they know the first car that they drove, they know what city that they grew up in. And so keeping in mind that many times they may be able to access or change passwords on things because they're guessing those particular security questions. We also want to think about, in addition to account safety, doing some security checkups on phones. And so assuming that most of us, if you're an iPhone user, you're not as familiar with Android platforms and vice versa. The other thing that we want to be thinking about, and one of the things that I find as kind of a miss in safety planning is people say, well, I knew the survivor had an iPhone, so we, went through the iPhone and we did X, Y, or Z. And then I'll say, well, what about, Android, or what about Google? Well, they're iPhone users, but do they use Gmail? Because a lot of iPhone users use Gmail. So there are ways to both with Android and Gmail do a security checkup. So like on an Android phone, you can have somebody go in and do a security checkup to see like what saved passwords do they have, look at their recent security activity, sign in information. On Apple, that process is actually called Safety Check. So on Safety Check, there is an option if you have a survivor who has suddenly fled a certain situation, they may have left behind a device or a computer or something like that. Safety Check actually has an option for an emergency reset. So if you go on an Apple phone to the Safety Check option and hit the emergency reset button that you see on the right side of your screen here, it will actually log them out of everything that they're logged into using their Apple account. So it will log them out of their iPad, it'll log them out of their watch, it'll log them out of all of that. So if you have somebody who's an Apple user, that might be a good strategy if they need to quickly get out of there. If you're using Gmail, understand that that account is important for lots of other things, and you can actually do a safety checkup on your Gmail account. So if you just type in safety checkup into Google and go to checkup, it'll log through there and try to figure out like what's your backup email. One of the things that I sometimes see happen is survivors will do a lot of safety planning, but then their recovery phone number or recovery email on a lot of their accounts are the offenders. And so they may accidentally forget about what they've done, or they're trying to get back into their account and they can't access it because the recovery email belongs to the offender.
Yeah, one of the things we talk about is just, are you comfortable setting up a brand new email that you've never had before that offender doesn't know about, this to send evidence to set up new accounts, or to essentially protect those accounts a little bit better?
Yeah, I know that strategy came from one of the advocates that you work with, Denise, that of setting up that Gmail account or whatever it might be and sending evidence to that account, not from a device that the offender might have access to,
Yeah.
but from a safer computer, and that's where they keep some of their evidence. And then they give that particular email's password to their advocate or to a trusted friend or mom or somebody like that who would be able to gather some of that if the victim can't have access to it. So it's a really
Right.
great safety strategy for being able to log some of that information in a safe place.
Well, the nice thing is they come in and we can have them access it here on one of our computers.
Yes.
So they don't have to worry about that offender getting access off of our computers, and it's right there. So I can go in and get what I need off of there and log them out when they leave or after they're gone. And that way they don't have to mess with it. Because sometimes like victims don't want to look at that evidence again.
No.
Right.
Yeah,
And like, well,
exactly.
here's my password, get what you need to. And I will assure I'll log you out. Don't worry. I've never had anybody push back. But again, sometimes they don't want to look at that stuff again.
Yeah. And it's a
Sometimes
really
they've
great
never
way
even
to,
opened it.
yeah. And it's a really great way to keep the information where they don't have to look at it all the time.
Mhm.
Or what we see is people end up keeping, well, I kept the evidence on my phone and then you dropped your
Yeah.
phone in the toilet or the phone got compromised or whatever happens. But having that safe, secure email can be a really great option. For those of you who aren't as familiar with like the safety check option that we just talked about, we did include in the PowerPoint, and Lacey did put in the chat, letting you know that you'll all get a copy of the PowerPoint if you want it. If you go to your settings and your privacy and security, if you go about 3/4 of the way down, is that safety check option. The other really important button under safety check is the manage sharing and access. So you can see who you're sharing things with. So if you click on that manage sharing and access button, it will actually show you, oh, hey, you share your location with so-and-so, or you. Now, there's going to be some generational differences. Okay. As somebody who's in my 30s, um, I don't share my location with a lot of people, but my 20-some-year-old daughter, yeah, if you're catching on to the math, that's not possible there. My 20-some-year-old daughter shares her location with like everyone, right? And I've had conversations with her. I'm like, hey, what are you doing sharing your location with everybody? And she's like, Mom, I live in Seattle. I'm a nurse who gets off the bus at 2 o'clock in the morning. I want my roommates, my friends to be able to have my location sharing. But if something should happen and she wants to stop sharing location with everybody rather than trying to figure out which app shares location with which people, if she just went into her manage sharing and access, she could just click on that and see who she shares that information with. So it's a really great way to walk survivors through who they're sharing information with. Because again, going back to depending on who set up the technology, if the offender set up the technology, they may be sharing stuff with themselves that the victim does not realize that they are sharing with the offender.
100%. And you have to also understand that this sharing of location is starting in middle school, right? So this is normalized behavior before we're even in high school. So, when you're talking about generational differences, right, you have to understand that kids right now in middle school and high school are actively sharing locations with multiple friend groups. So that is normalized behavior, and you have to really break that down for that individual and explain to them once these behaviors are happening, like why this is not okay.
Uh-oh, I ruined some child's life because somebody said they came to a Spark conference in Montana and learned about all this and then went home and realized what their kids were sharing. So apologies to your kids, but glad we could teach you something in that
Yeah.
particular conference. So,
Yeah.
so the other thing that we want to be thinking about with location tracking, we've seen these devices become smaller and smaller and smaller. I remember one of the very first trainings I went to on technology when we were talking about GPS devices. GPS devices back then were gigantic, they were expensive, et cetera. One of the things they told us to do in training was if there was a GPS device that, a victim found on their vehicle or something like that, they told us to wrap it in tinfoil. Okay, so we've progressed a long ways now to realize that that's not a good strategy. And then the GPS devices are getting smaller and smaller. And we see offenders becoming more and more inventive with what they're using. This particular case, this is a picture of a device that was found on a victim's vehicle. This bottom round thing that you see right here is actually a magnet. Luckily, our offender was stupid. We like it when they aren't the smartest. And they left the serial and barcode on this particular magnet, which they purchased at their local hardware store. So we were able to just go down to the local hardware store and get information about who bought the magnet. But this is the GPS device at the top. So they just wired it to the magnet. put some duct tape over the top of it to make sure that the light wasn't shining. And it was actually a pet tracker. So it is a device that you can use to track your pets. So obviously, we see things like this, but we see things like air tags that are used as well. Keeping in mind that, especially when it comes to GPS documentation and evidence, sometimes we can get evidence off the offender's computer or phone if they're logging in to that device. If they're getting text messages, a lot of GPS devices now have geofence options, meaning you can draw like an imaginary circle around an area. And if something leaves or comes in and out of that area, it will send somebody a text message. So you might be able to get to the text messages going back and forth between that app and the offender's phone. It could be equipment purchase. One of the things that we talk about sometimes is that some of the easiest evidence to get is financial evidence. So you have an offender who is signing up for a service and suddenly enrolled in tags monitoring service, but it's not hunting season, so they don't need to keep track of their dog at this particular moment in time. So that financial evidence can sometimes be taken in to consideration a little bit easier than it might be to send like a warrant to someplace else. But that visa information, that credit card information can be really important.
Especially if it's a reoccurring charge.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The other thing that, hold on, I want to keep up to, okay. So for those of you that are asking for the slides in the chat, they'll be sent out to you if you registered for the event. So you don't need to put your emails or anything in the chat. And as Denise said earlier, she's like, I don't get a lot of AirTag cases anymore. Like the offenders aren't that stupid. Like it's going to give somebody a notification if it's following them. We still see people who set it up that way. They don't really care if the victim gets a notification or they share an account. So if they share an Apple ID, again, because the offender set up the victim's phone, there might be an AirTag associated with the victim's account that they don't know about. Or we have offenders who are going in and turning off like the Bluetooth or trying to disable notifications, etc. So we did want to give you a little bit of information when it comes to AirTags, knowing that if you get a notification that an AirTag is following you, and so what happens is if you're an Apple user, you get a notification like this that just says, hey, there's an unknown AirTag or there's an AirTag that's following you. Denise and I were together last week doing a training. So we met at an airport. We got into a rental car. I risked my life by letting Denise drive. And then just checking to see if you're paying attention to Denise.
Oh, yes.
By the time we got to the hotel, she's like, hey, your AirTag's following me, because she knows I travel with an AirTag all the time and it's giving her this notification. So Apple users will get this notification. It used to be that if you were an Android user, you would not get a notification that an AirTag was following you. But then the industry made some changes because they were sued and they started having notifications for the opposite brand's device. So if you're an Apple user, you would get an alert that an Android device was following you. If you're an Android user, you would now get a notification that an AirTag is following you. But for those of you who are Apple users, one of the things that I wanted to kind of test out early on when AirTags came about was to figure out how long an AirTag had to follow you before you got a notification. Apple still says they don't have a definitive time, but what happens is if somebody gets a notification, so this is just a screenshot of me giving an AirTag to a young person in my life, letting them travel back to a certain location where they lived. And then I wanted them to take a screenshot of what the notifications look like so I could show you all in training. So this is just a screenshot of Chelsea's phone in this particular case. So you'll see that it said, hey, this AirTag has been following you. And it was following her for almost an hour before she got a notification. And when she got the notification, she had the option to make it play a sound, meaning she could set the sound off on the AirTag to try to locate it if it was in her vehicle. She could try to find the AirTag, like if I had hidden it on her vehicle somewhere, or she could pause the tracking notification. So if I'd given her my keys and she's like, yeah, I know Jennifer's keys are following me, I don't want to know that anymore, she could just pause the notifications. The buttons that are really important for survivors are those ones up here where you can either make it play a sound or you can try to find it. So if you click on the Find Nearby button, what it does is actually bring up a screen that shows you and walks you through like where to find the AirTag. So for those of you who have AirTags, this is the same button that we push when we're trying to find our keys or something like that to locate it. What's also really important, especially for those of you who are law enforcement and others who are trying to help victims keep documentation about the AirTag, is this button right here that says Learn about this AirTag. So what this does is if you find the AirTag and you click on this Learn about this AirTag, you can actually scan the AirTag and it will give you the serial number and the last 4 digits of the phone that the AirTag has been paired with. So let's walk through that for just a second. So if Chelsea had clicked this Find Nearby button to try to find the AirTag, what it will do is bring up this screen. It'll show you like, hey, this is where that thing is. It's about 11 feet away. As you get closer to it, it eventually turns green, starts buzzing, etc. It will give you a directional arrow about where to find the AirTag. When you find the AirTag, you have the ability to try to scan it. Now, if you have a victim who brings an AirTag in to Denise, which we already said, not smart, because then whoever is monitoring the AirTag would see that they brought the AirTag into Denise. But if Denise met them at an auto mechanic or something like that, and they said, hey, this is the AirTag that I found on my car, Denise, because she's an iPhone user, could just bring up her iPhone and go to the Find My on her iPhone. And at the bottom where it says People, Devices, Items, and Me, she could click on Items. Now, if she has AirTags, it'll show the AirTags or AirPods that she already has. And then she has the Identify Found Item right there where she can scan the AirTag. If she doesn't have AirPods or an AirTag, she would have this screen. It would just say on items, it would just have this like backpack looking thing. And if she swipes up, she also has the Identify Found Item button. If she clicks that and she scans the AirTag, it's going to bring up this particular screen right here. And then it's going to bring up the serial number and the last 4 digits of the phone that the AirTag was paired with. So as an investigator, Denise wouldn't have to necessarily find the AirTag, take out the battery, find the serial number, send the information to Apple. She can easily scan it with her phone. Anybody can, even if you're not law enforcement, scan the AirTag and get the information off the AirTag. Now, then she would still obviously have to turn in all the stuff to Apple, do it for her warrant, et cetera. But this would give her enough information at the very beginning. Say, for instance, if she was going to try to apply for a protection order, if she was going to try to give information to the victim, et cetera. Now, the chances of it being anybody else's phone number but the offender's is pretty low. What I will tell you is if it's not the offender's phone number when you scan it, is it mom's phone number? Always mom's. Or the new girlfriend's.
I'm telling you, it's these moms.
It's the moms. So any questions on how to do that for those of you who weren't familiar on how to scan an AirTag or get information off of it?
Yeah, and keep in mind, like we were together, what was it, about 2 hours before it notified me that it was following. Like I was already checked in. So you're still looking at a decent time lapse where you're going to be notified that an AirTag is following you. So,
yeah. Any questions from anybody in the audience about how to do that? Were folks already doing it? Is it new information? The chat has suddenly gone quiet.
Yeah, right.
So either everyone's bored.
New and useful information.
Okay.
Yeah,
thanks, Kim. All right.
Bailed you out.
Yes. All right. We also want to, and this could be a whole training, and yes, you will get the slides. No worry, because it's fast. Yeah.
Yes.
Or if a plug for CCAW, I believe we're giving this presentation at the CCAW conference in May. So if you want to sign up in person. The other thing we want to talk about, and like I said, this could be its own training in and of itself, is the non-consensual distribution of intimate images. So what happens when we have offenders who are sharing intimate images of victims? And are there some individuals or organizations that can help in those particular cases? There's a couple of resources that we want to call out here. Number one, the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. If you're not familiar with them, fabulous nonprofit that exists to address the issue of non-consensual distribution. They have an image abuse helpline that survivors can call that can help them. They've got a really amazing website as well. So walk survivors through some of the things that they may be able to do to enhance their safety. The second one is stopncii.org. Now, stopncii.org is kind of like the adult version of a NCMEC process. So what it can do is for websites and social media platforms that opt into it. And there's the tricky part right there.
Caveat, right?
Yeah. It is if a victim, say for instance, has an image that they know has been shared on Facebook. And they don't want to come in because they're embarrassed. They don't want to give the image to Denise. They're like, I just want this picture taken down off of Instagram, wherever he or she may have posted it. If they go to stopncii.org, essentially what they do is create like a digital fingerprint of the photo that was shared. And then once that digital fingerprint is created, it sends it to all of the social media and website platforms that are enrolled in Stop NCII, and it pulls the image down. So Facebook, Meta, anything that's owned by Meta, so Facebook, Instagram, et cetera, will pull those pictures down. Now, the issue with that, the only caveat is if I do that and the images get pulled down, and then 2 weeks from now, I come in to Sergeant Jones and I was like, hey, my ex-partner shared these pictures. They were up on Instagram, et cetera. And Denise tries to do some type of search warrant or get information from Facebook. It doesn't exist anymore. So if a victim chooses to do something like that, they need to know that the evidence disappears as well. So again, we said we wanted to offer you tools that if somebody doesn't want to engage with law enforcement, the conversation I always just have with folks is just to say, hey, FYI, if you do this, and then 3 weeks down the road, you decide you want to go report to Sergeant Jones, the information is not going to be there. So just something to be aware of.
And that's a conversation to have, right? I've had victims come in. This is a big topic for us, especially with former intimate partners. That's a conversation to have, like, hey, these are some resources, but keep in mind, if you do that, the evidence is going to be gone. And like Jen said, more often than not, especially in those particular cases, they don't want to move forward with criminal charges because they know that those images are going to be back in court and someone's going to see what they've got going on. So
Yeah.
just having a good conversation with that person and letting them know what their choices are again and explaining what their choices are and what essentially how you can move forward is very beneficial when you're interacting with these victims.
The question that someone had in the chat was, how effective can something like Stop NCI be if we have AI images or fake ones? They use certain points of reference, and they have to have like so many points of reference to be able to actually identify the image. So it's not as effective with fake images. Just depends on what the image is, how many reference points there are to take it down, et cetera. So not as effective, still worth a shot if somebody wants to do it that way. But that can open up a whole different.
Yeah, and so we're also using Clearview AI, which we can put a picture in that system and it'll search 70 million pictures to include social media. So that is a new tool that we're using. I don't know if anyone else is using it, but that's something that we use as law enforcement officers to drop in, and then it'll essentially scour the internet for us to find pictures, and some of the pictures that come up are not close to, but more often than not, you're going to get everything that's social media based, anything that's on the internet, they're going to pull that up. So that could also be something, especially if it has to have a face in it, but that could be something that you could use as well to identify where these images are.
So let's talk about some of these safety strategies that we can think about in these particular cases. And so, one of the things that I think is really important to have a discussion with survivors about is disengagement. The conversation that I always have is like, yeah, it's ideal if you're able to disengage from the offender completely. Don't text them back, don't contact them, et cetera. Ideal, not practical. Okay, probably not going to happen in lots of cases. But one of the conversations that we oftentimes have is, people will say things like, well, if a victim was really so scared, why did they have contact with the offender? Why did they call them up? Why did they, continue to engage with them, et cetera? Sometimes the answer is because we make them, because they have kids in common. And sometimes the answer is, for most individuals, is they maintain the contact because it's safer to maintain the contact. If they stop contact, then they're worried that that will make the offender escalate. And so if we're thinking about safety strategies, especially when it comes to technology, sometimes they're not willing to block somebody. Sometimes they're not willing to kick them off of their platform, et cetera, because they're worried that it will escalate the offender's behavior. And one of the things that we need to be thinking about, and just because they do that doesn't mean we don't have a stalking case, okay? So one of the things that we need to be thinking about is if we're safety planning with folks and trying to figure out, like, what does that look like? The tech safety planning has to be part of our core safety planning. You can't just do regular safety planning and not tech safety planning. And I know some of you are going to be like, but I'm not tech savvy. That's okay. All right. Just having conversations with folks, bringing up the technology, asking them what they use, putting them in touch with somebody who might be more tech savvy is a really important first step, right? And understanding that, especially if you have somebody who has separated, if they've left the family home, something like that, walking through some of those things after separation to figure out, like, did somebody leave something behind? Is there some kind of electronic device that the kids have, tablets, watches, those types of things that sometimes people forget about? Or as Denise mentioned, am I still signed into my old iPhone account that is in the drawer because all of us still have 17 iPhones that we've had from previous years still in a drawer somewhere in our house, right? If you're mapping out devices, those old things that were left in the house, any shared computers, the victim logged into their Gmail on the offender's laptop and never logged back out, right? Any shared desktops, people still have desktops, okay? Anything that they were gifted from the offender. I think some of the things that we have a tendency to see people forget about are devices that they were signed in to, like Ring cameras. So the offender has access to the Ring camera account still, and so is monitoring the victim even if the offender was removed from the home because of a protection order, right? Or is there some kind of child device that, is it a GPS in their shoes because they're cross-country runners? Is it, some other kind of home camera? We've even seen things like smart refrigerators used. I had a stalking victim who went down to report to law enforcement, and they all thought she had mental health issues because she was getting text messages from people saying things like, I think you're out of orange juice. And she's reporting that to a patrol officer who's like, what?
Yeah.
And she had purchased a smart fridge off of Facebook Marketplace, and the person who owned the fridge still had the app and was still logged into it and began stalking her. And so he would send things like, oh, we changed brands of milk, or looks like we need to go grocery shopping, or somebody must have been on vacation because the fridge hasn't been accessed. And she's like, what's going on? So just keeping in mind that as our lives get more and more tech heavy, there's more and more things that can be compromised. Anything else that stands out to you from that?
Yeah, and a lot of times what we see, and someone dropped it in the chat, and I'll get to it in just a second. But what we're seeing is, especially offenders that have had access or can guess a password or reset it, they'll take over an account. So, like for us, they'll take over like a utility account or something else, and we will push that. If there's a protection order in place, we'll try to push that as a violation because you're interfering with the person's ability to occupy the residence, right? But one of the things that we struggle with, and Caitlin, thank you for bringing this up in the chat, a lot of times judges and juries don't see a physical injury when it comes to these particular types of crimes. So you'll see a lot of lighter sentences, no jail time, and it is important. Again, I to appreciate advocates, right? It's really getting what that victim's mental health status is and impressing that throughout that case if you possibly can, right? So we had a case, again, we worked for 2 years, and to watch her mental health decline and how that impacted her. So when I'm writing narratives, I want to put in there how I'm seeing that victim impacted, how I'm seeing her mental health decline, where she's at as a level of fear for her safety, right? Because that's important for judges and juries to know, to make it make sense for just the normal person, that when we don't have that visible physical injury or damage, there are things still going on in that background that still causing fear for safety, still causing mental decline, and all these other things. And it's important for us to make sure as law enforcement officers, we're talking about that in narrative. So when it goes to court, that's something that the prosecutor can harp on. Because the case that we had, there was no physical injury, but we did get 9 years. So it's just something that you need to think about it when you're doing these narratives. Yes, anything. Sorry, in the chat again. Yes, the bark phones. I'm telling you, like anything that you could possibly think of, an offender will find a way to exploit that for their use.
And those high risk scenarios, when you have a victim who has left an intimate partner relationship, all those things that we all know about high risk scenarios, typically our most our two focuses are location and communication, right? Like how is the offender going to try to communicate with the victim, and how are they going to try to ascertain their location? And so really understanding that, is there a way to establish safer communication? Somebody brought up the bark phones. What does that look like, type of thing? What does the survivor use to communicate? How do they communicate? Is it helpful for them to get a safer phone for a little while? That's a boost phone from Walmart or whatever it might be, to be able to have access to their friends and family for a smaller amount of period of time, right? And understanding that when we're trying to establish that safe communication, a lot of the things that we need to be thinking about is, can we create a parallel form of communication? So we use phone, can we get that parallel phone of a boost phone? A lot of folks, and again, I think this goes back to people saying, well, they should just get off Instagram, or they should get off Facebook or something like that. Like, oh, how many times have you all looked at your phone during this training today? Like probably at least 5 or 6 times, right? You're checking your text messages, you're checking your social media, et cetera. And then you're going to ask survivors to give that up? No. Okay. So is there a safer form of communication? Can they get a new Instagram that they don't share with anybody but their close and personal friends? Can they get a different way of communicating with, other folks that the offender might not have access to? And so really trying to think about what's safer. Obviously, there's nothing that's safe if you have a determined offender, but there might be some things that we can put in place that can make a victim safer in these particular cases. Denise mentioned earlier, if we have somebody who's documenting things, don't assume a certain level of tech knowledge, right? Like we say, take a screenshot, and then we get frustrated because they took a screenshot that doesn't have the times in it. Or they took a screenshot that has, baby daddy at the top as the contact person, and we don't have a phone number, right? So really being able to walk people through, like, what does this look like? Like, how do we, establish communication? How do we establish who has access to the evidence? Can we pull things to the left to get the time numbers, et cetera? So we just included it in some of your PowerPoint things. And some of you probably already know this. Some of you might just need a little bit of a reminder, but knowing that, can we get a picture of the contact card with that, with Brian's phone number here? Can we swipe to the left so we can get the time that comes in? I think the time is also really important, especially when you're talking about a stalking case, because it can show you escalation and state of mind. So if you're getting 17 text messages and they're coming in one after another and not giving the victim a chance to answer, that's helping us show what that offender's state of mind might be at that particular moment in time.
Yeah, and the other thing to think about is how are we being used to stalk, right? So we're going to get calls out at midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning to do a welfare check on the child when they're with the other parent, right? And so how are you monitoring that in your CAD system? And then how are you ceasing that when you see that it's being used essentially to terrorize that victim? And then one of the things that, if we go back a couple of slides and don't have to go back, but just to mention there, will your court mandate any kind of parenting app? So everything is done in that app. communication is only to be about the children, and that app records everything and cannot be deleted. And then that victim can download that, give it to you, and you can go through and give it to your prosecutor. That's one of the things that we use here that's absolutely amazing, but something to think about, right, are those parenting apps. And that way nobody can delete it. It's there, it's solidified, it's a court record, and we can use it for evidence.
But to that point, a lot of times it takes work on the behalf of the
Yes.
survivor
Yep.
to get that information downloaded, give it to
Yep.
somebody. I do a lot of court trainings where everybody's like, "Oh, we use My Family Wizard." I'm like, "Okay, so who's monitoring My Family Wizard? Like, who's monitoring that to make sure the offender isn't taking advantage of it?" And then I get a lot of deer
Nobody.
headlights, right? I'm like, nobody. I'm like, okay, so it's great that it's in place, and who's making sure the accountability is still
Yeah.
there, right? When we talk about collecting evidence, a lot of the things that we want to be thinking about is where can we get some of this evidence? Is it on a computer, a cell phone, social media, Internet of Things, which is just anything that's connected to Wi-Fi, so fitness trackers, gaming systems, et cetera. We didn't even get into things like fitness trackers and gaming systems, which could be a whole training in and of itself. But just trying to think about where that evidence might lie and how can we get some of that particular evidence. And we're not going to make you like evidence collection experts in a short training like this. What we are going to do is recommend a couple of places that could help you become better experts at collecting evidence. And then be thinking about preservation letters. Anything you want to say with that, Denise, with the preservation letter concept?
Yeah, I mean, make sure you're getting these in as quickly as possible. The turnover on some of this information is 72 hours or less. So if you think about it takes 6 to 12 months for a victim to self-identify, and if that offender's changing tactics, we may lose that. I know that companies will say 72 hours. I would still say serve the preservation letter and try to serve service on it and let them tell you they don't have it versus just be like, oh, we're outside the 72-hour window. I'm not going to do it. But get these in as quickly as possible to start that preservation process so it can't be deleted. So what we'll have here, Facebook will be used, and then that person knows that they've come in to report to me, so they go back and delete Facebook. Right. So if I get that preservation request in ASAP, even if they go in and delete it, in their mind, they're like, yeah, I'm home free. I deleted it, but I still have it because I've preserved it. So you're still good with that information.
Yeah. I think the other thing that we want to just, if I can get to the slide, is just keeping in mind, like, what information you get with what particular request. So the difference between a subpoena, a court order, and a search warrant, right? Obviously, the more you can go for, the better, right? You might not be able to reach that particular standard, but just being familiar with what provides what. I think sometimes we see, especially new officers who might be going for something and, sending a subpoena when a search warrant would have been better, that type of a thing. So just a little bit of a reminder to just do your due diligence when it comes to what information is out there. I think the other thing that we really want to highlight for all of you is there's a lot of really great places to get more information. So at Spark, I said we were doing this particular presentation under something called the Just Tech Project, which is on our investigation prosecution of online abuse. We now just received funding to start the new National Resource Center on Cyber Crimes. So the two crimes that will be addressed under this new resource center are cyber stalking and intimate image exploitation. So we have partnered with some really fantastic people in the field. So Spark is a project of Equitas, which is the prosecutor's resource on violence against women. We also paired with the National Network Safety Net team. The Cyber Civil Rights Initiative that we talked about does intimate image distribution work, and NW3C, which is the National White Collar Crime Center. Do not be confused by their name. NW3C has phenomenal training for those of you who are in law enforcement. So if you've never taken an NW3C training course before, highly encourage you to do so. They've developed some new courses as part of this NRCC project, as well as part of the Just Tech project. That new National Resource Center on Cybercrimes website should be launched within the next 1 to 2 months, that we will have available on Spark's website. We'll be doing a ton of training just like we do with Spark trainings in general. And the new project manager for that that I've hired is phenomenal. She is a cybercrimes person, but also has a background in advocacy. So she will be leading that project, and we'll be having a ton of information come out. Right now, what we're doing is building the website. So hopefully that will be launched soon, and you will have access to that information. But again, if you want to go to NW3C, if you're law enforcement, take classes from them. Even law enforcement, non-law enforcement can take classes from NW3C. You just get different access to different courses depending on your profession. So highly
Yeah,
encourage
they're
you to reach out to all
absolutely
those
amazing.
places. Yeah, I know you're a big fan of their training, Denise. So any questions that folks have for us? We tried to leave a few minutes for questions here. We also are going to list some resources in the handout that you're getting, including some walkthroughs and guides, both on Apple Safety Check, from the Clinic to End Tech Abuse, the CEDA program, information on phone plans, et cetera, and links to Stop to NCI and the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative as well. So definitely check out those folks. This is Spark's website. Highly encourage all of you to check out the things that you can do during Stalking Awareness Month. We have a day of action coming up on January 18th, where we encourage you to participate in memory of Peggy Klinke, who was killed by her sister, or by her stalker, and her sister started a effort to bring awareness to that situation and helped found NSAM in 2003. So definitely check out Spark's website for additional information. And this is our contact information that you'll get in the PowerPoint handout that Lacey will send out. And then I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Lacey is able to share her screen. So.
Thank you so much. This has
You're
been great.
welcome.
I know, and it looks like everyone has learned a lot. I am going to share really quickly our Conference on Crimes Against Women dates. And I will say, yes, come and you can hear lots more presentations from Jen and from Denise and from them together. And yeah, it's a ton of fun. So we do have just a couple minutes left. So if there are any questions, please put them in the chat. Yes, you will get the recording will be on our website a lot, and then we will send out the handout. You will receive an email at the end of today's webinar that gives you a link for a survey. And then once you complete the survey, it will give you access to your certificate. So if you have any issues with that, please feel free to email us. And here is our contact information at the conference.
Denise, people are saying in the chat that we must work well together. So we fooled them well for the last 90 minutes. So we just want to say a huge thank you to Lacey and the conference, because they are always hugely supportive of this issue and offer phenomenal training. It's a phenomenal conference. So thank you for the opportunity to be on today, Lacey.
Well, thank you. And we'll give a plug really quick about our roll call training that we have that we did with a few years ago. So if you go to instituteccr.org, our website that I'll put in the chat, there is a roll call training that is broken down into smaller 8 to 10-ish minutes. Thanks, Jen, for doing that. 8 to 10-ish minute video sections. So if you want to share that, it's great for training. It's also great to share with your local law enforcement, or if you are local law enforcement, to train your new recruits or anyone. So, all right. Well, I don't see any other questions. So we will go ahead and close out today. And you be sure and be on the lookout for our next training in the month of February. We're going to have UGMA joining us. We don't have a date yet, but and talking about creating domestic violence fatality review teams in rural communities. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right. Well, have a good one.
You too.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.